Hello again. Welcome to Tipping Points, episode 31, where we will ask key questions about how to preserve biodiversity while balancing conservation and development. This webinar series is an initiative of the Oppenheimer Generations Research and Conservation. Webinars usually take place on the last Thursday of the month at 1 p.m. I am Kina Murphy, Chief Scientist and Africa Director for the Campaign for Nature, which is focused on protecting 30% of the planet by 2030. And this is in part why we are here today. Since the CBD COP15 took place in 2022, the goal of protecting 30% of the planet by 2030 has taken front row in many conservation discussions. This is because we stand to lose 2 million species by 2030 if we do nothing. Protecting 30% of the planet ensures that at least some of those species will not go extinct. But at the forefront of the debates about whether 30 by 30 is a reasonable goal or not is the position that we cannot ask countries to protect 30% of their lands and seas while ignoring their development needs. We, as conservationists, cannot be seen to yet again displace local people in order to protect nature. In the CBD negotiations, South Africa led many of these types of opposing positions, but the 30 by 30 goal is not a global goal and not a national is a global goal and not a national goal. Each country maintained the right to set its own targets, and South Africa not only set its own targets, but was one of the first countries to begin developing its 30 by 30 strategies. Instead of agreeing to protect 30% of South Africa's land and seas, South Africa set the goal of conserving an additional 1.4 million hectares of land through protected areas and another 10 million hectares through other effective area-based conservation measures by 2040. We call them OECMs. OECMs are geographically defined areas outside of protected areas that are governed and managed in ways that deliver long-term in situ biodiversity conservation. Unlike protected areas, which have conservation as their primary management objective, OECMs may have other primary purposes, but still effectively contribute to biodiversity conservation, which brings us to our topic today. Today, we will focus on how the conservation community can develop new approaches to biodiversity protection by engaging landowners, communities, the private sector, and conservationists. How can South Africa use OECMs to protect 10 million hectares of land for biodiversity while also supporting the needs of the communities that live on those lands? I'm glad to be here with you today and look forward to a productive and insightful discussion. Please be aware that this session is being recorded and will be available on the Oppenheimer Generations Research and Conservation YouTube channel. This is also where you can catch up on webinars you may have missed. I encourage you to sign up for the OGRC quarterly newsletter and stay tuned to OGRC's social media channels so you don't miss upcoming webinars and announcements. We're excited to have you and have such a good turnout today. Please continue to introduce yourselves and engage in the chat box, and don't hesitate to use the chat box for any questions at any time throughout the webinar. Thanks. And now I will introduce our speakers. First, we have Brian Morris. He is the manager of Protected Areas Expansion and Biodiversity Stewardship in the Mpumalanga Tourism Parks Agency. Morris has been very active in a land restoration and rehabilitation project. Hi, Brian. And restoration and rehabilitation project within the Kapsahuop area for the past 5 years on a forestry stewardship site, which primarily entails the removal of alien invasive plants and rehabilitation of degraded sites formerly planted to commercial forestry plantations. Then we have Simon Pooley. He is an interdisciplinary environmental educator and researcher passionate about the social and ecological dimensions of environmental challenges. He is currently a Lambert Lecturer at Environment at Birkbeck, University of London. He is the co-editor of Histories of Bioinvasions in the Mediterranean and the author of Burning Table Mountain, an environmental history of fire on the Cape Peninsula. And finally, but not least, we have Natasha Wilson. She manages the expansion of South Africa's national parks through voluntary biodiversity stewardship agreements with communities and landowners, as well as land purchases. She served as a founding steering committee member of the International Land Conservation Network and currently serves as a trustee on the Table Mountain Fund, a capital conservation trust fund that develops and funds projects to protect and restore fynbos. I will hand it over to Simon Pooley to give our first presentation. Thank you, Simon.
Thanks very much. I'm delighted to be here. So I'm going to give a case study. I'm slightly Mr. Bad News today. I'm going to just sketch out some of the history of nature conservation and stewardship of natural resources in South Africa. And then just to set out the range of sort of challenges and how things have shifted over time. And then the other guys are going to get into some of the solutions and some of the stuff outside of protected areas. So I'm just going to share my screen. Is that visible? Yep, great. So I was blessed to grow up in Ndumu Game Reserve, a little pocket of extraordinary biodiversity nestled in the confluence of the Usutu and the Pongola rivers in northern KwaZulu-Natal. It's small but beautiful, with yellow fever tree-lined lakes teeming with waterbirds, fishes, harumphing hippopotamus, crocodiles basking on the grazing lawns, the Lembombo Mountains blue in the distance. As a conservationist, I suppose I'm evidence of the lifelong impact of a childhood immersed in the natural world. I was very fortunate to grow up in a game reserve, but many visitors also became lifelong supporters of conservation. On the other hand, Black South Africans were evicted from this fenced reserve. This was to maintain a refuge on the country's most biodiverse floodplain for animals, which are difficult to live with, like crocodiles, hippos, rhinos. Some of my childhood friends' parents had once lived inside the reserve, therefore, until the pressure of a growing population with their fields and livestock and pets became too difficult to sustain. It's worth recalling, however, that locals had been living alongside the wildlife from the proclamation of the reserve in 1924 up until 1966. So my playmates now lived outside the reserve, and because of apartheid, they had little access to the picnic sites, the hides, the camps reserved for whites. How are they supposed to develop a caring relationship with wild animals and places? How continue their ancestors' remarkable coexistence with wildlife? When remittances failed to arrive back from the mines, mothers and children entered the reserve to catch animals for food. What had been subsistence use was now classified as poaching, and it was the ranger's legal duty to catch poachers. For example, locals caught with sackloads of weaverbird chicks destined for the pot or setting snares. Conservation staff struggled with their consciences torn between compassion for these hungry people and the need to protect wild animals inside the reserve. Ndumu Game Reserve turned 100 last year, making it one of Africa's oldest game reserves. A few of us celebrated its remarkable survival and the dedication of generations of white and black South African conservationists to ensuring this. But it's under serious threat today, with its eastern region under occupation by farmers, fishermen, and cattle herders. This includes the fertile Pongola floodplain, former breeding grounds of crocodiles, habitat for hippos, and source of winter grazing for antelope. Like many protected areas across Africa, Ndumu has a history of conflicts with its neighboring communities over the evictions, over killing wild animals, and because animals leave the reserve and eat locals' crops and their livestock on occasion. In the 1960s, agricultural development was planned to transform this remote and impoverished region. A massive dam was built to transform the Makatini Flats into irrigated commercial croplands of sugarcane or cotton. But this has failed. Livestock diseases persist and commercial cattle farming has also failed. There's little work here. After apartheid ended, Ndumu Game Reserve was handed to the new Provincial Conservation Authority, Ezemvelo KZN Wildlife. The first Black South African reserve officer in charge took over, and co-management with communities commenced. The era of fortress conservation run by whites was over. So what's gone wrong? Well, it's complicated. A land claim settled in 2008 obliged Ezemvelo to collaborate with the Tembe and Matenjwa communities, but co-management was never defined, and the terms of the land claim were disputed, and they still are. The KwaZulu Ngonyama Trust got involved. Overlaps and conflicts between different traditional authorities, municipalities, provincial departments, and national ones really complicate the conservation landscape in South Africa. Further, during fierce political campaigning in the 2004 and 2006 elections, politicians made rash promises to give locals land in the reserve, which was illegal. Then afterwards, electioneering promises of development funds did not materialize. In an area with a growing population and high unemployment, this failure to deliver led to anger and fence cutting in 2008. The game reserve was the most prominent local symbol of provincial authority and a lightning rod for frustration. Communities were also not seeing the promised benefits of reserve co-management. While controlled harvesting of natural resources is allowed and some jobs provided, cash benefits are modest. In reality, the reserve struggles to cover the costs of its own staffing and maintenance. People cut fences again in 2010, and they moved in. It's unclear from exactly where. They are tilling and grazing the last 10% of the Pongolo floodplain not yet farmed. Gillnet has moved into the last protected breeding ground for the fishes which repopulate the floodplain upstream, providing vital protein for poor communities. NGO-led community development interventions aimed to improve attitudes to conservation have failed. The Transfrontier Park has not materialized. Neither the local police nor the army will intervene, leaving this illegal occupation of provincial land to the poorly resourced and demoralized game reserve staff to handle. They have effectively abandoned all land east of the Pongolo. This violates the conditions of Ndumu's status as a Ramsar wetland of international importance. Helpfully, Ramsar offer expert advice when listed wetlands run into troubles like those at Ndumu. Unfortunately, the Department of Forests, Fisheries and Environment say South Africa has its own national body responsible for determining threats and response, and no outside help will be requested. Well, after 15 years of illegal occupation, the loss of all the rhinos, shocking declines in crocodile and hippo numbers, and a mineral prospecting application in progress, well, surely it's time to act. If we're committed to finding new land to conserve, to achieve 30-30 targets, I think that's important, but let's not forget to protect the land we've already got.
Thank you so much, Simon. That was really beautiful, actually, and not negative. I think it's good to frame these issues, because if we don't look at the issue, then we can't solve it. So it's all about solving the problem. So thank you. And now I will hand it over to Brian. Brian Morris, take it away.
Okay. Yeah, I think land has always been a contested space in South Africa due to our country's painful past. And while debates about compensation or expropriation without compensation dominate headlines in South Africa, these debates obscure, I think, a much deeper and more complex reality across the country, where citizens, rich and poor, black and white, urban and rural, are locked in agonizing battles over land and what it should be used for. In the context of the ongoing battle over land and resources in South Africa, conservation is frequently cast as an elitist luxury, something that gets in the way of jobs and housing and food production and other needs. And I think this framing is not only outdated, but it's also dangerous. Conservation at its best is not about walling off nature. It's about recognizing our interdependence with the land, with our water, with our climate, with our food systems. And if the land is degraded, so too is our ability to thrive and survive. But for conservation to stake its claim in the national land debate, it needs to shed its colonial legacy of fenced-off game reserves to embrace a more inclusive and more holistic vision and implementation. One way to move forward beyond the notion of exclusive ownership and exclusion of communities is towards shared stewardship. And this means recognizing that land holds multiple values, ecological, economic, spiritual, and that these values can coexist. Cutting through the contending rights means more than just better policy. It actually means better politics. We need forums for real dialogue where different stakeholders can air their grievances and negotiate shared futures. The Mpumalanga province is the 5th largest of the 9 provinces in South Africa, covering an area of just over 76,000 square kilometers or 29,500 square miles. And the province has developed the Mpumalanga Biodiversity Sector Plan in 2005, and this plan has undergone various iterations and revisions since then. The Biodiversity Sector Plan has been developed using sophisticated planning software known as systematic biodiversity planning. Now, systematic biodiversity planning involves mapping information about biodiversity features and the pattern of these features within the landscape or the planning domain that we're dealing with, in this case, the province, setting biodiversity targets for each of those features, and then analyzing the information using this specialized software linked to geographic information systems, or GIS. And the underlying approach in systematic biodiversity planning is to identify the most efficient way of safeguarding a representative sample of biodiversity that is able to persist over time on the least amount of land possible, whilst avoiding conflict between biodiversity objectives and other land uses. The amount of each biodiversity feature, be it a vegetation type, or a species of conservation concern, an ecosystem, or a nest site, which is required for it to persist and contribute to sustained ecological function, is quantified by setting a biodiversity target for that feature and using an explicit approach based on the best available scientific information for that particular feature. What we end up with when we do this biodiversity planning is a CBA map. And this basically shows our most critical areas, which are known as CBAs. And then also showing our ecological support areas, other natural remaining areas, our protected areas within the landscape, and then and the modified or transformed areas within the landscape. Biodiversity planning attempts to select targets in areas having the lowest conflict with other land uses and other land potentials. But conflict, however, is inevitable in many cases because the high biodiversity areas, your CBAs and so on, often overlap with high mining areas or areas of high agricultural potential. And especially in our province, our most critically underrepresented biome is the grassland biome. This is where we really need to meet a lot of targets for 30 by 30 and protected area expansion and other mechanisms for protection such as OECMs. But within the grassland biome is located most of the mineral reserves, the coal and so on. So there's inevitable conflict with other land uses. This results in disputes. Our biodiversity sector plan has been put together at a very fine scale, 1:10 and 1:25,000 scale. So it can be used for planning at a local level as well as the level of a farm, of an individual farm. And at the municipal scale, all of this information has been integrated into spatial planning, into SDF, spatial development frameworks at the local level. But the integration and alignment of these plans with municipal and, with provincial and national planning and development agendas has proven to be more difficult and relatively ineffective. Strategic land use planning is lacking at that level, leading to mining and other competing land uses seldom losing in areas of high biodiversity value, whilst areas of high biodiversity value virtually always lose out. Informed by this biodiversity sector plan, we've developed in the province our provincial protected area expansion strategy, and I'm just showing 2 maps here. The one is the 5-year priority areas and the other is the 20-year priority areas. And based on these priority areas, this is where we are attempting to work and to expand protected areas, and also to set up other mechanisms like such as your OECMs. And importantly, when we do declare protected areas, formal protected areas, they are protected from mining developments. Our province and the country has ambitious targets in terms of the 30 by 30 protocol, or targets that have been set in the Kunming-Montreal protocol. And we are moving slowly towards that. Now, the mechanism that we use to expand protected areas and to secure land in terms of other mechanisms such as your OECMs is the Mpumalanga Biodiversity Stewardship Program, whereby protected areas are declared on land owned by private individuals, by communities, by companies and trusts. And landowners sign up their land in long-term commitments to essentially manage these areas as protected areas and according to accepted ecological practices and principles. Now, examples of these sound ecological practices include, for example, the appropriate use of fire as a management tool, improved grazing and veld management practices and systems, protection of wetlands, the clearing of alien invasive plants, and so on. So we're not creating protected areas which are fenced off, such as your traditional sort of game reserves that we've had in the past. We're talking about productive landscapes where there are multiple land uses taking place, where there's farming taking place, and landowners are subscribed to a better way of managing these lands. When I say landowners, I'm talking communities, private landowners, etc. In the stewardship model, the Mpumalanga Tourism and Parks Agency, who I work for, facilitates the declaration of the land, provides the technical expertise, develops the management plan with the landowners in accordance with these sound management principles. And the landowners are the custodians and stewards of these new areas, of these new protected areas. Largely, the mechanism which we use is the protected environments, which is a slightly lower category than a nature reserve or a national park. And this is where you can allow these multiple land uses such as agriculture and forestry and so on to coexist with conservation. So we have made some progress in expanding protected areas over the last 15 years or so. I joined the Mpumalanga Parks Board, or Mpumalanga Tourism and Parks Agency, in 2009. So over the past 15 years, we've managed to add 162,859 hectares to the protected area estate. But at the current rate of expansion, it's going to take us another 68 years to meet our 30% target. We do work very closely with NGOs. Without the EWT, BirdLife South Africa, Conservation Outcomes, WWF, and Kruger to Canyons, we wouldn't be meeting these targets. We rely heavily on the support we do receive from NGOs, and this is essentially a partnership around expanding these protected areas. What's critical about many of these areas is that they're also located within strategic water source areas. So by securing the biodiversity, we're also securing our ecological infrastructure. In addition, many of the protected areas that you see bordering the Kruger National Park there are the privately owned nature reserves. And within that part of our province, which is essentially in the savannas, it supports wildlife tourism and the wildlife economy. And there's many jobs created on those areas and very exclusive lodges bringing in many tourists from outside. Just some of the challenges I thought I'd end with in terms of the work that we're doing around the expansion and its stewardship is we haven't really been able to secure enough community sites under conservation, be they protected areas or other effective measures. And this is often due to the complex nature of community governance structures, as well as the skewed land ownership within the province. As land transformation and restitution is happening, we're able to take up more of these projects. But essentially, we haven't really made much progress in terms of community-owned land. Open cast coal mining is steadily eating away vast tracts of land in the grasslands in the high veld of our province, on a lot of the conservation-worthy grasslands, and this is also where most of our critical water catchment areas are located. And there's often indiscriminate granting of mining rights even within some of our protected areas, and there has been some good precedent in court cases to defend off these mining rights and safeguard our protected area network. There's a massive expansion of wind energy facilities in the province. This is basically due to the fact that there's grid capacity here for these wind energy facilities to link into. And these facilities are going to have massive impacts on birds and bats. And we're facing a huge challenge with the wind engine facility expansion within the province. There's also not enough viable incentives for landowners to sign up their land for conservation. Although we've made steady progress, there needs to be more incentives for landowners. The conservation agency itself is poorly resourced, and we don't have the necessary capacity to roll out expansion at the rate necessary to meet the 30 by 30 targets. And lastly, in light of all this expansion that we have done, I wouldn't say we tend to neglect that we already have, but we require additional resources to continue to manage what we already have effectively. So we're chasing targets, but we kind of neglecting what we already have, and that I see as a serious challenge. I thank you.
Thanks, Brian. That was really great and really eye-opening. And I think we saw some solutions in there, we saw some problems, and it's great framing for the discussions that are to come. So thank you so much. And Natasha Wilson, now we will hear from you and South Africa National Parks about what you think some of the issues, solutions, and ways forward are. So take it away.
Thank you so much, Kina. I'm confirming that you can hear me, and I will now be putting my presentation in slide mode. Thumbs up if I'm good. Okay, thank you. It's really great to be here today. Thank you very much for the opportunity. I wanted to start off by saying that the work that I'll be sharing with you today is not a SANParks only initiative. SANParks is leading in some areas and sharing quite a lot of information about the mega living landscapes and this new approach to conservation in South Africa, but by no means are we doing it on our own. It's very much a partnership approach. So just to start off with, we do not have ordinary biodiversity in this country. We have quite remarkable biodiversity in our country. And I think that does require a reimagining of how we will conserve this very important and unusual biodiversity that we are blessed with. And I think that the idea of what I'd like to share with you is a little bit different to what the two previous presentations have shared with you. It's looking at some of the challenges that we shared, but also some of the tools that Brian spoke about to take this work forward. So, what we've seen from a SANParks perspective, being the biggest conservation entity in South Africa, is that there is a call for change. There's been a couple of important policies, strategies, and frameworks that have come out. And what you see when you put all of them together really is a call to action. And how do we go about conserving our biodiversity as well as being inclusive? So this is just a map to show that in terms of how we conserve in South Africa versus the rest of Africa, we've got lots of little bits here and there, and that maybe it's time for us to consider what would it look like if we put all of these different bits and pieces together, considering the sound conservation and scientific principles of corridors and climate resilience, for example. So if we as SANParks wanted to chase our 30 by 30 targets, it would take us in our current rate 52 years to make a mark. And I think the point there is that is just not good enough. So SANParks has launched Vision 2040, which takes us beyond 2030. But the idea really is, how do we go about working in a way where people can live in harmony with nature? Now, I will admit, SANParks previously really we worked very much within our fences and within our boundaries, and this is quite a radical departure to be moving outside of our boundaries and our fences, and to be working in a more inclusive way. I think that the country has been doing a lot of landscape scale conservation for more than 20 years. We've only just got onto the bus, but we are quite excited. And we do think that there's an opportunity to work in mega living landscapes, which really is looking at large interconnected areas, including people, including cultural heritage, including socioeconomic outcomes, and considering people as well as conservation. So some of what's important to consider is in our new drive, it's around being inclusive of people and addressing some of the limitations that brought about by excluding people, working beyond our fences, so outside of protected areas, and also looking at the role that multi-functional landscapes, the role that it can play and the opportunities that come with that. So there's a couple of pillars I thought I would just quickly touch on, because I think the audience will find resonance with some of what I'm going to share now. So it's managing and protecting conservation areas or protected areas, and also ensuring that they're managed well, inclusive economic growth, regenerative tourism. So it's not just taking, but taking and giving at the same time. Looking at social legitimacy, so understanding the role of sharing of power and ensuring that we don't take dignity away from people when we're trying to do the work that we're doing, as well as understanding how SANParks itself as an organization needs to become a better version of itself. So, you know, very much a learning space, very much needing to understand how we can build on what's been done well in the country. And then, of course, underpinning the role of climate resilience and sustainability. So this slide really is just to show that if you look at where we currently are in terms of our current protected area hectares, SANParks is looking at making a significant contribution to what is currently protected. Key here is we will be catalyzing in some areas, we'll be leading in other areas, and we will be supporting in other areas. So in no way are we asking or putting forward that we will claim all of these hectares. So what does this look like? Considering things like strategic water source areas, important biodiversity areas, KBAs, all of the good science that we have in this country, we have identified 3 nodes. Ochrabis has also become one of the areas that we would like to focus on. And the idea is that we would look at a number of projects that we have within SANParks and projects still to come and align it under our 2040 vision, trying to catalyze, support, implement, drive mega living landscapes again with partners. So we've got a GF8 project that's recently been approved, as well as a Global Biodiversity Framework Fund project, which looks at some of the durable financial mechanisms that we'll need as SANParks and an organization to walk the talk. So you can see on this slide, there's a couple of hectares, a couple of numbers of people. It's not insignificant, but there's a lot more that we need to do in order to reach our 30 by 30 targets. So I think I'm going to skip some of this, but you will see you should be able to resonate with some of what I've put on the screen here. So it is about being inclusive. It is also about understanding people and the needs that they have. So I'm going to skip a little bit forward because I've reached my time limit. And what's really important here is the role of biodiversity stewardship in underpinning the rolling out of SANParks' vision around landscape scale conservation. And here we're looking at a role of mechanisms that is underpinned by legislation. But if SANParks wants to do this work, we are going to need to change in many ways. And for me, what's important here is the role of extension. So working with landowners, with landholders, and influencing the people who actually look after our natural resources or have control over those. And so looking at initiatives like the cross-sectoral extension group, where you are trying to pool resources and initiatives and people who are doing similar kinds of work. This stewardship work that we are looking at also includes working with emerging farmers, working with communal farmers, as well as private landowners. And I think I'm going to close off with this slide, which is an example of what a mega living landscape could look like. We are busy declaring a new national park in the grasslands near Maclear. It's in the northeastern Eastern Cape. And here we are working with a range of landowners who are willingly contributing their land to conservation. And we've taken quite a different stance here. We are looking at livestock as a way, as a driver in an ecosystem to form part of a national park. Lots of challenges, which we are hopefully going to turn into lots of opportunities. It is very difficult doing this work. It is very difficult learning as you're doing. Currently, we've got just more than 10,000 hectares in the pipeline for declaration later this year. And so despite the challenges, it is possible. Kina, thank you.
Thank you so much, Natasha. That was very inspiring. And yeah, just really, really beautiful presentation from all of you. And so I thank you. And I think you've framed this conversation well. And now we're going to sort of start to move into the discussion part of this webinar. And I want to ask an initial question to Brian, and these are questions that were put in the Eventbrite question box. And so we're going to start there, and then we'll move into a different part of the discussion later. But I wanted to ask Brian, do you have any tips for how to develop good stewardship plans, networks, basically how to create like this biodiversity stewardship network, like really some advice for other people for how to do this? And I guess the other part of the question is, how can we ensure that communities have land tenure and the same opportunities as the wealthier landowners? So how do these things become integrated and placed into a more sort of fair landscape, I guess is the question. It may be a little bit convoluted. And then sort of with that, how do you then begin to declare protected areas in conjunction with with community involvement? And I guess this is a question I'll answer, but I'm just posing it to Brian first.
Well, yeah, I mean, selling stewardship as a model to get land under conservation has taken a long time, and we've walked quite a road to get where we are. So it's about creating awareness that there is this mechanism out there. We do work very closely with the NGO sector that have a lot more people on the ground that are engaging communities on a day-to-day basis, promoting the concept of stewardship and having their land under conservation. And if you looked at the stewardship model, it is really about multiple land uses within a landscape, with conservation being able to coexist with those multiple land uses. And I think, as Natasha mentioned, using some of the agricultural practices as your management tool. So grazing, for example, let's get grazing more sustainable so that you have good biodiversity outcomes. So we're not talking, as the traditional fenced-off conservation areas. We're talking about living landscapes. So it's about, firstly, selling your product, getting out there and exposing the public and exposing landowners to what's possible. In many instances in our province, landowners have been attracted to the concept of having their land under conservation because they're fearful of mining and the expansion of mining, which is eating up large tracts of land. So that, in one way, has been a blessing in disguise, because it's created very much a lot of interest from landowners to secure their land and secure it from mining. And then, of course, we need to build, once we have the land under conservation, we continue to work with these landowners to build the capacity to bring in the better land use practices, and get landowners to start applying this good management, Look, in terms of the current land tenure in the province, it is largely skewed towards commercial white farmers. And as the province moves forward in terms of land restitution, we are taking up some of these projects on community-owned land. But South Africa isn't, it's very different to vast parts of Africa where land is owned by communities. Here, our land ownership is very skewed. We do have pockets of state land where we're trying to implement projects with communities, or what we call tribal land, but it's actually state-owned land. And we do have some land reform projects where land has been restituted back, where we have some stewardship projects. And also, almost all of our provincial nature reserves have been claimed. So we have a whole program that is focused on co-management of our existing protected areas, because they've all been, almost all of them have been restituted and claimed by communities. And we have had some reasonable success in co-managing these reserves with communities. Some of the other questions, Kina, around the declaration. I think you mentioned a question around declaration, but I can't remember exactly what the question was.
It was actually pretty simple. It was just, what's the process for declaring protected areas? I mean, we don't really have to go into the details of that. Yeah, but
right.
Yeah, I think that's
there is a clearly defined process for us to declare protected areas in terms of the Protected Areas Act. We do have to advertise the intention to declare the land. We have to notify various government departments. One would be the Department of Minerals and Energy, and others. So it is a consultative process, and by no means easy to do. It takes time. But the first step in the process is to get the landowners buy-in and the landowners' consent, and then we're halfway there. We have had some cases where we've tried to declare protected areas and there's been objections from some departments, and that has put the brakes on a bit. Yeah, so it takes time, anything from 12 months to 2 years to actually have an area finally declared.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, that's great. Thanks for that. I guess this next question is for Natasha. How do you think that 30 by 30, this 30 by 30 goal will affect Indigenous and rural people globally? And what, I mean, I guess is, how do we, I guess the real question is, how do we level the playing field, I mean, if we have, we know sort of like that, Africans have historically safeguarded biodiversity for the entire rest of the world for, millennia, right? And so we want that to continue, right? And this is true of Indigenous people sort of globally, right? And we want that to continue. So how do we put mechanisms in place to ensure that that continues to happen, I guess is my question.
Yeah, so globally it would be difficult to speak to, but in terms of what we have control over here and influence over in South Africa, I think it really is around recognizing what you shared and understanding that there are many opportunities to level the playing field if we are willing to take the time. But we can't do it in the same way we've done conservation previously. We would have to change tack. We would have to listen more. We would have to understand more. And we would have to ensure that the mechanisms that we have in place to conserve biodiversity also supports local and Indigenous communities. And it's going to ask for a rethink. And so it is going to ask for intentionality. It's going to ask for learning. It's going to ask for working together rather than working in silos. And that would be a good start, I think, to shift the needle and to ensure that we don't continue on a trajectory where we're excluding people rather than actually recognizing Indigenous peoples and communities for the work that they have been doing in so many spaces.
Yeah. Yeah, no, that's really beautiful. It's like learning, understanding, listening, and
Yeah.
respecting. Yeah,
Yeah.
it's beautiful. Thanks. And Simon, just a question for you. So how, what's your opinion on how we promote conservation and coexistence in multi-use landscapes? What do you think the ideal OECM would look like, I guess?
Big question.
I know it's a hard question.
I think that what we've been hearing is that there are these different levels. There needs to be this high level enabling environment and targets, but unless you're convincing people on the ground to come with you, it's not going to work. But one of the problems with helping communities to be stewards of their land is that they need to have power over that land. They need to have they need tenure. So Eleanor Ostrom, the famous economist, studied uh, natural resource governance institutions around the world to try and figure out what makes them work. Because there's this common idea that as soon as something's in communal management, people will just use it to the hilt. The tragedy of the commons, they're going to ruin their land. It's the old philosophy, those farmers are just going to graze it flat. Actually, that's not the case necessarily. There are many places around the world where communal management works fine, but only if there's a locally empowered group of people and agreed system for how to do that, and there's boundaries that other people can't just come in and use that land. So yes, I really believe that coexistence can work at a community level if people are empowered and helped. I saw there was a question about herding for health. I don't know a huge amount about it, but I think the most important comment on that is to understand that protected areas, which are completely fenced ones, are very important as well, but they exist in a porous landscape and wild animals come inside and out. They don't stay. And historically, there have been periods of drought where people were allowed to bring animals in to graze or access water. Maybe we just need to be a bit more flexible about how these things work. I think the herding for health is a really good idea, partly because, of course, game reserves depend on what people are doing outside them, the rivers coming into them, fires that are lit for grazing, all of these things. If it's going badly outside the reserve, it's going to go badly inside the reserve. So yeah, I think it's a good program, the Herding for Health. I think that if you can empower people to manage better their land and their grazing and keep their cows safe, that's wonderful. And they have some good ideas there, and they definitely could be better implemented around Ndumo. Your animals are more your animals are more exposed if you don't look after them well. But let's also be real about indigenous communities and traditions. The world's changing. The kids aren't out there herding the cows. They're at school. So we also have to figure out clever ways of working around the fact that we're living in this crazy country that's very modern and very traditional in the same places sometimes.
That's so beautiful about South Africa, actually, I keep this webinar is making me, I'm like, I want to move to South Africa. It's lovely. Anyway, so we're really out of time, and I'm sorry that we don't have time for a lot more questions because I think this conversation is just super exciting. And I every time I have these kinds of conversations, I want to just go deep. I feel like we could spend 5 hours on this topic, but hopefully, everybody will stay in touch, and network with each other. And So thanks for all of the insights. We just have a few minutes, so if you guys have any key takeaways that you would like to share with the folks on the webinar, please, just just express those in the last few minutes that we have, and then we'll wrap up. I don't know, just raise your hand for whoever would like to start first, but any sort of last takeaways? Yeah, go ahead, Brian.
Yeah, I think as a country, we are exploring this new mechanism, which you referred to in your opening, Kina, the OECMs. It's something that is still being, strategized about and discussed, and we're developing norms and standards and looking at the legal issues around securing these sites. And obviously one wants to make it almost easier to secure land under OECMs. It shouldn't be as onerous as a reserve, a nature reserve declaration. So it is an emerging area of work in South Africa. And one of the areas that we are looking at in the Mpumalanga province is working with commercial forestry, because they hold vast tracts of land, and about a third of the land which they hold is not planted and is very important for conservation. Again, it's not focusing on community land, and as I mentioned even in my presentation, is that we have very few opportunities where we can engage communities to secure land for conservation, because most of our priorities are not really located on those community lands. In terms of our biodiversity sector plan, we do work where the priorities are located, and that's where we put in our energies. But certainly, as we move forward, we should not be, only focusing on commercial or agricultural lands. We do need to improve our engagement with communities and community-owned land, but it's difficult to find that land in this space where we work. But there are some projects where we are making some progress around that. In bordering on the Sabi Sand Wildtuin, for example, we're trying to bring in some community land into the actual Sabi Sand Game Reserve, which is a 5-star setup in terms of lodges and so on. And there would be some good opportunities there for job creation and so on. But it's small parcels of land that we're talking about. We need to upscale on a massive scale, and so we have our work cut out for us.
Thanks. Yeah, that's great. And Simon?
Yeah, just to sort of second what Brian's saying, I think there is actually a lot of homegrown, local, indigenous interest in conservation. It shouldn't be seen as a sort of battle to convert people to something entirely new. Upstream of Ndumo Game Reserve, there's a community reserve. It's just never been supported. It hasn't got the help it needs. There are people who really care about their local land, and they'd love to run it in a way which is more favorable. It's just this, struggle for resources, particularly in these remote areas. And the final thing I wanted to say is that something that troubles me from time to time is the tendency to talk about conservation paying its way. And, in these really remote places, it's very unlikely. And if you say conservation must pay its way, if it's about money and you're starting to put rand value on what it can offer, conservation is going to lose every single time that the mining or the whatever the latest scheme to grow cotton comes along. So, people don't only care about rand. I know that might seem very easy to say, but they don't only. And so we can work with this. It is a homegrown thing here, I think.
Yeah, no, I love that. I mean, yeah, it's about, I think that absolutely indigenous peoples, it's not a new thing to conserve their land, or local people. It's not a new thing to them. And it's important to, remember that actually, I think that the land is invaluable and it's priceless, actually, and that we cannot put a price tag on it. So, Natasha, sorry. Go ahead.
Yeah, just wanting to say, come join us at SANParks in any way, shape, or form. There's a number of mega living landscapes across the country. We are not a gatekeeper. We would like to encourage partnerships, learning, collaboration. Contact me if you're interested in any specific area. Really, I think it is about being open to trying and looking beyond the challenges. Thanks.
Yeah, that's a beautiful point. Thank you. So join SANParks, and let's start to change this whole conservation landscape. And I love the mega living landscapes slogan. I think it's awesome. Yeah, so super inspiring. And thank you all so much for the time. Thank you to all the viewers. Simon, did you want to say one last thing? Or was that a
Legacy hand, but
Okay.
if I can join this hand to that hand, I'll just thank the other guys. It was really quite inspiring. Thanks.
That's awesome. So just to wrap up, I wanted to let everybody know that the next OGRC Tipping Points webinar is scheduled for the 26th of June, and it's entitled Blue Planet, Bright Future, the Ocean's Role in Life, Climate, and Sustainability. Keep an eye on our social page for the registration link, and then sign up for the OGRC Quarterly newsletter to stay updated on future events. And you can find the link in the chat box. So thanks everyone for joining us. This has been really great, super inspiring, and hope to stay in touch. And I hope all of you can network and stay in touch on the subject. Bye.